Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this RACI webinar. Please bear with us. We have a few people still signing in. We'll be underway very shortly. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Paul. I'm from RACI. Welcome to today's webinar. Just before we get underway, I'll just quickly run through some housekeeping on how you can participate, and then I'll hand over to Gerry and his colleagues. So the first thing I need to do is change this slide. Okay, the slide on the screen at the moment shows the control panel that will be on the right-hand side of your screen. By clicking the orange arrow, you can make it come out to the left or go back into the right. The small white triangles on various panes or panels in this app let you choose or reveal different controls. The audio pane lets you choose how to listen to the webinar and test your audio settings. If you have any issues with audio during the webinar, you can switch, for example, from the default of computer audio to instead listen by phone using the dial-in number and PIN that you will have received with the email. Microphones are muted, but you can ask questions at any time by typing them into the questions pane. Time permitting, we'll get to these at the end of the session where there's a scheduled Q&A for about the last 15 or 20 minutes of the session. Please note too that Gerry and his colleagues have agreed that if they don't get to any questions, we'll do our best to get them to Gerry in writing and they will come back to you. And with that, that's the end of the housekeeping session. I will now ask Gerry. I hope you're ready, Gerry. I'm going to throw to Gerry.
Hi, everybody. My name is Gerry Redmond, and I'm one of the chief investigators on the project of the work that we're going to be discussing today. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands from where we are making our presentations. That is the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the Ghana people, and the Ngunnawal people. I'd like to pay respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and to any Indigenous people in the audience. Now, sorry, wrong slide there. This webinar that we're presenting work on today comes from a much larger research program on young people's well-being. The project itself is funded by the ARC, but it's been built on a whole series of projects that in turn have explored different aspects of child and adolescent well-being. They're quite numerous, but you can find the links to them on the project website. A number of themes have run through these projects. They're all concerned with amplifying young people's voices. They're particularly concerned with the lives of young people who are marginalized in the Australian context. They focus on assets and resources available to young people for their development, well-being, and life chances. And they're concerned with how policy in health, education, and community services, as well as overarching policy narratives, can impact on their lives. Now, the Wellbeing in Adolescence project, which started in 2019, This involves chief investigators from Flinders University, that's Pammi Raghavendra, Colin MacDougall and myself. Also Fiona Brooks at University of Technology, Sydney, Jen Skattebol at the University of New South Wales, and Jill Main at the University of Leeds in the UK. The work being presented today is the result of collaboration across the entire project team, including postdoctoral researchers, two of whom will be presenting findings today. The research has been greatly supported through consultation with the project advisory group for the project. That includes representatives from RACI, as well as NGOs and advocacy groups, and representatives from state and Commonwealth government agencies. So the aims of the Wellbeing in Adolescence project, from which these presentations are coming, is to investigate risk factors for exclusion of young people, to identify assets and resources as protective factors for young people, and there's a focus on assets today, to explore young people's lived experiences of their daily routines, and to examine impacts on outcomes that are important for their lives, their education, their mental health, their well-being, and their life chances. And as I said, with this webinar, we're going to focus on assets. So first, Fiona Brooks is going to talk about an assets model, an assets model which can describe how assets can be a positive force for young people's health. Then there's going to be two applications of this model. Firstly, in terms of contradictions in the lives of young carers with Thomson, and then Young People and Neighbourhood Belonging by Sabera, Turkmani. So now I'm going to pass over to Fiona for the first presentation, where she's going to briefly talk about the assets model.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Fiona Brooks, and thank you, Gerry, for the introduction. I'd also like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation from whose lands I'm speaking to you today. And apologies for the disembodied voice, you won't be able to see me, but this webinar system doesn't seem to like the new Mac upgrade I'm using. So if things go further awry, my colleague Colin MacDougall, who worked with me on developing this theoretical framework, will take over. So what I'm going to talk to you about is how we can think differently about the resources and types of intervention that will enable young people to thrive. In the project work you will hear others talk about today, this conceptual framing is critically explored. The assets model that I'm going to talk to you about is primarily drawn from health research. So those of you not working in the health field, please bear with us, because what we want to explore in this project is a much needed consideration of how the assets model can be extended to other domains. So I'd really welcome thoughts and questions at the end from those of you who are not working in health, but on how we might develop this model and extend further, and the relevancy of this model for your own work. So the assets model actually came from the work of an Israeli scholar. In 1979, Aaron Antonovsky introduced the concept of salutogenesis in the study of health development. And he was a scholar who looked at the life outcomes of survivors of the Holocaust. And not surprisingly, many went on to have difficult and challenging circumstances and struggled many parts of their lives with things like alcohol and substance misuse and depression. However, given the circumstances the Holocaust survivors endured, many not only recovered and survived, but went on to report that they thrived. In explaining this phenomena, Antonovsky proposed that there must be health-causing factors. So ultimately, out of Antonovsky's search for human factors that characterise these survivors came the salutogenic model. And salutogenesis is one of the things you're supposed to never do. It's a combination of Latin and Greek. This salutogenic model proposes that the goal of our research should be to identify, define and describe pathways, factors and causes of positive health and well-being. He argued that acceptance of a disease-based model, a pathogenic model of health by most traditional health professionals had dictated that disease prevention, treatment and management were the only paths to better health. But just as common sense tells us that the absence of bad behaviour does not indicate the presence of good, research consistently has demonstrated that simply decreasing a negative state does not necessarily increase positive states. Antonovsky differentiated salutogenesis from pathogenesis by describing it as a model or framework focused on discovering the causes and precursors of health and identifying health. And health is taken to be in that broadest framing. It's not just, we will go on as we explore the assets model, just the absence of disease. The whole framing is about actually what enables people to live a good life. Hence, it has a much broader relevance to how we might traditionally just see health. The salutogenic approach to health promotion in particular posited that we needed more than just traditional approaches to prevention. We need more than just individual approaches to telling people what to do or how to improve their lives, what to eat or what they should do to maintain health. But we need much broader efforts to actually cause health in people. And from this came assets-based thinking. The critique of current policy based on a deficits or parthenogenic approach or a disease-based approach is that it leads inevitably to focuses on individuals and therefore their failure. So we focus on the failure of individuals and local communities to avoid disease rather than their potential to create and sustain health and their own continued development. And you can see this, for example, in just the way obesity is sometimes approached in terms of the individualising behaviours that are focused on, and even discourses around how, you know, obese people don't warrant treatment in healthcare systems because they've brought much of their associated health issues on themselves. In young people in particular, we also see this approach having a very dominant framing because it's very much focused around health risk behaviours and young people's own participation in health risk behaviours. So its focus has tended very much around young people to be the dominant framing and focus actively on their own choices they've made to participate in health damaging behaviours. These deficit models are problematic for a number of reasons. They require high levels of professional resources and dependence as well on hospital and welfare systems because they focus on risk factors and disease. Individuals and communities then become identified as failing to make adaptive changes towards health and are labelled and stigmatised. And think about that notion around, you know, asking people to constantly make adaptive changes. For young people navigating adolescence, and particularly the focus on their participation in health risk behaviours, this, I think, is associated with an increased societal rejection of young people. Young people who are seen, for example, on the streets are seen very negatively because they may be participating in risky behaviour, which is antisocial. So young people become, therefore, a problem to be fixed. And this, in turn, has prevented questions being asked about what promotes young people's own health and well-being, particularly from their own perspective. So we have tended as well to focus, when we think about young people, as them as adult becomings, as only their health risk behaviours are damaging because they result in long-term conditions in adulthood. In contrast, an assets-based approach argues very much that the more we provide young people with opportunities to experience and accumulate the positive effects of protective factors, the more likely they are to achieve and sustain health now and well-being as well in later life. So what is a health asset? Well, a health asset, and this is important, I think, and another important point that often gets overlooked when we talk about strengths-based approaches or we talk about health assets, is a health asset can be defined as any protective factor or resource which enhances the ability of individuals, their communities and populations to maintain and sustain health and well-being, or thriving, or life outcomes. This has led, I think, to a critical critique of some of the approaches around strengths-based approaches. And that's been a tendency to focus on the individual project, the individual person. So rather than health assets being seen as either individual, internal to the person, or external, what we've tended to do is focus on building resilience in people and seeing it as a personal project. While not disputing at all the benefits of social and emotional learning and development programs, because they have been demonstrated to be really important, the assets-based approach argues that on their own, they're insufficient to really enable young people to thrive. And that just seeing a strengths-based approach as a personal project is insufficient. And even early on in the developmental consideration of assets-based approaches, that point was made very clearly. And this is some of the work that came out of Scales Institute in America and the Search Institute, which argued right from the beginning that the protective relationships that we put around the young person, so schools, their family, become critical enablers of not only critical assets, but they become critical enablers of young people in terms of ability to mobilise assets. But particularly that additive list only represents a starting point. So there are two key principles we've taken forward in this project. One, that assets most meaningfully manifest in the transaction between the person and their environment. Just thinking about the individual person on their own is insufficient and inevitably leads, I would argue, to a deficits approach. And Morgan and Ziglio, some of the main theorists of thinking about assets, have argued that most of the assets, if not the most significant ones, are not located in the individual person. So they're not about self-esteem or resilience, but they're located in the social context of people's lives. So that's around school connectedness, school belonging, warm and effective and supportive parenting, community-based resources. So in thinking about how strengths-based approaches, assets framing have perhaps been thought about or have often been translated readily, there's often been a simple additive listing approach. The more the merrier. The more assets we have, the better it is for the young person. What's also been problematic is there's been a lack of connectivity between assets theory and the material realities of young people's lives. And simplistically, there's been a prioritising of the psychosocial factors and this can lead to a potential for victim blaming and underplay how important broader social determinants construct high health and life outcomes. And I think this is one of the most critical points, that we don't want to accidentally fall back into a deficits approach by focusing only on the individual or internal assets. So what is significant in terms of an assets framing? Well, it focuses on positive health promoting and protecting factors for the creation of positive life outcomes. There's an emphasis on a life course approach. So it's not just about seeing young people as adult becomings. We don't only intervene now because of their future life chances. We intervene because we need to improve the quality of life across the whole life course. It necessitates the need to involve young people in all aspects of health interventions and developmental processes. Their perspectives are critically important. It recognises that many of the key assets for creating youth wellbeing lie within the social context of young people's lives. And it helps us reconstruct and critique existing knowledge and existing policy because it gives us a different way of thinking about it. So in this project, we've taken some of the limitations, or we're trying to take forward some of the limitations of assets framing and some of the strengths and build them into a new way of thinking more broadly around young people's health and well-being as a starting point. And then we want to see if it can be applied to other domains. So the important thing to frame first is that all of the assets work as a virtuous circle together. The physical assets young people have, the social assets, and the psychological and emotional assets all work to reinforce each other and work together. So, for example, we know that warm and effective parenting with good communication support for young people enables young people to translate those skills into positive peer relationships. School and teacher connectedness can be compensatory mechanisms that enable young people to thrive when they don't have perhaps support from other adults in their lives. This then leads to a strengthening of social inclusion and strengthens social cohesion young people experience. If you grow up in a supportive community where you achieve a sense of belonging, where you feel safe and there's trust, that also reinforces back again your ability to mobilise your assets. This then, and in this model, we very importantly want to separate out notions of well-being from health. And we're using that broader salutogenic framing of health. So health is very much not just the absence of disease. It is that salutogenic framing that I started with. But we want to think about how the assets impact on all the domains of well-being, from cultural well-being, mental well-being, physical well-being, spiritual and sexual well-being for young people. However, assets require the ability to mobilise, to be mobilised. So they require political action. They require support from the surrounding adult environment of the young person. They require young people's participation in analysis and interpretation of the types of interventions that we mobilise for them. And it requires proportionate universalism. Without that, many young people, because they live in situations of material and social inequality, they cannot mobilise assets, particularly internal assets within them. So one of the ways of thinking about this is that we often think of resilience as, you know, the dandelion child. In Sweden, there is a notion of the dandelion child, the child that can thrive in a crack in the pavement. And that's often how we think about resilience. But what assets enables us to do is to think about the non-dandelion child, the child that could actually, with some additional support surrounding them, actually also thrive. So the questions we're seeking to address in this project: are some assets, protective factors, more important than others? What are the cumulative effects of multiple assets on young people's mental and physical well-being? And how do different social and cultural contexts impact on the benefits of those assets and young people's ability to mobilise them? Okay, thank you. I'll now pass on to Cathy Thomson, who will explore the mixed model further in relation to young people's lived experiences.
Thanks, Fiona. So the data presented in this part of the seminar examines how young carers navigate pathways often deemed to be at risk based on traditional measures, while at the same time developing assets and resources that support them and others to participate. In this analysis, we build on the model, we're building on the model just presented by Fiona. It uses young people's own narratives and applies them to the model to examine the contradictions in their lived experiences. I'm just going to turn off my camera so it's not too distracting. The term young carer refers to people aged between 25 years and under who provide unpaid support and assistance to people with disability, chronic illness or frailty due to ageing. I should note that in the census, young carers are defined differently as those between 15 and 24 years who report spending time providing unpaid support to family members or people with disabilities or health conditions in the 2 weeks prior to the census night. So in the 2016 census, just over 151,000 people aged between 15 and 24 years were identified as young carers, and that was a slight increase in the proportion of young people who identified in 2006. However, this number is an underrepresentation of young carers because obviously the definition doesn't capture young carers under aged 15 or even those aged 25 years. And in Australia, at the federal level, young carers are identified and targeted in policy as one of the groups most at risk of long-term welfare dependency. Research shows that they have lower rates of Year 12 completion, higher rates of disadvantage in terms of employment and income, and than young people without caring responsibility. However, these typical risk factors don't take account of young carers' lived experiences and the other ways they contribute and the assets they develop through providing care. The 2 young carers I discussed today are drawn from the qualitative data from the ARC project Stories of Resourcefulness, which is highlighted in blue on the screen. And as Gerry mentioned, this forms part of the broader program of research that we're analysing for the Discovery project. The source study consisted of a purposive sample of 44 young people recruited mainly through frontline staff in different youth services. We interviewed young people from 6 different sites in metropolitan areas and regional towns in New South Wales. Biographical narrative interviews were conducted with these young people at 2 points in time. This type of interview provided a space for the young people to tell us about their stories without interruption, and consequently we collected very detailed and rich data about their lives. The first young carer I'd like to talk about is Tula. That's not her real name. She was 25 years old and had 4 children aged between 23 months and 7 years. She was a young carer of her oldest son with Asperger's. Tula had a difficult start to life. She described her childhood as hard. She said, "I was premature because of my mum's drug addiction. Dad took me from day one. It was just hard for him being a single dad and trying to work. Dad had money some days and then some days we wouldn't get anything. Not having anything in the cupboards, it was pretty hard. It was just me and Dad and then his girlfriend that came and went. I didn't really go to school much. We moved every 6 months." However, Tula did have some periods where she felt safe and well cared for when she was smaller. A couple who lived in the same street let her stay with them when things at home were rough. During these times, Tula had more stability. She went to school regularly and made friends. The couple couldn't have kids of their own and thought of her as their daughter, but they moved away from the area when Tula was about 12. Then, without any warning, her dad, in her words, up and left me. Tula recalled, "Then Dad met some lady and we ended up staying with her for a bit, and then he just left and left me with her. She let me stay for 2 weeks, but my dad wouldn't answer his phone, so she just had enough. She already had 5 kids of her own. We ended up getting the police to come and get me, and docs became involved." Tula went on to say, "Docs rang my best friend from school. I ended up going to stay with her and her family. I stayed for 3 years. The family looked after Tula and provided her with a calm home life with adults she could count on." Tula stayed with them until she had a falling out with her friend. But despite moving out of the house, the adults in the household continued to help her if she needed it. Tula was then placed with various family members for short periods of time, the last of which was her auntie. Tula commented, "I stayed there for a bit until I was 16. She didn't like my boyfriend. She told us to leave. So I left and went and stayed with my girlfriend." She went on to say, "My auntie gave me so much drama. She'd come running to my girlfriend's house for people to come and drag me out of the house. It was pretty full on." The conflict with her auntie continued, and during this time, Tula left school and then had her first child at 17. Using the conventional risk indicators, Tula checks many of the boxes. She's a young parent, she disengaged from school, she was unemployed and was a young carer. However, despite these risk factors and the challenges she faced growing up, Tula is determined to give her children a better life. She said, "I'm trying to give my kids a lot more than what I did when I was a kid." Tula has created a secure and supportive family life for her children and has also become a tenacious advocate for her son. She commented, "My son has officially been diagnosed with Asperger's on the broad spectrum, and the school that he's at now isn't meeting the standards that he needs to help him. He's basically going to get lost in the system. So I've got to change schools again and sort all this stuff out and figure where to go. So it's a never-ending battle right now. You've just got to basically push and ask questions until they answer you." Tula has highly developed help-seeking skills, and as the quote illustrates, she is focused and can identify and locate resources required to support her son and to guard against him getting lost in the system. So rather than focusing on the significant risk factors evident in Tula's story, if we view her journey towards independence from a different perspective, that of assets, a different story emerges. We can see that through her life experiences and her caring, Tula has developed different assets that she could mobilise. So in terms of the model presented by Fiona, what assets has Tula accrued and how are these mobilised? Tula's story shows that she has well-developed social assets, so that's on the left-hand side of the screen. When growing up, she had experiences with adults outside her biological family that provided stability and support. This enabled her to attend school more regularly, gave her capacity to build peer relationships and a support network. These friendships provided Tula with emotional support and who she turned to when her family life was difficult. Also, the adults outside of her family could be considered one of the key mobilisers for Tula because the stability and care provided offered her with an alternative perspective on family life and further broadened her support network. They also provided her with physical assets such as secure housing, where she could establish and maintain relationships. Another important mobiliser for Tula was the key worker. So the mobilisers are in the middle part of the diagram. Was a key worker at an aftercare service that helped to organise wraparound support once she left her auntie's house. She built a trusted and supportive relationship with the worker, which she valued, and the worker helped her to navigate bureaucratic processes associated with accessing income, support and housing. Tula's experience of building relationships with trusted workers and adults have assisted her to mobilise the assets she's acquired. They have enabled her to develop help-seeking and advocacy skills needed to access the resources for her son to support his education needs, which provide important foundations for his future well-being. However, the components in the model, the assets, the mobilisers and outcomes, are situated within the existing processes and structures that can either be enabling or create barriers that impact on well-being. Tula's son's access to support is determined by availability, quality and affordability of services and in the local area, and Tula's highly developed help-seeking skills will have little impact on her son's future if the only support available to him is of poor quality or unaffordable. The second young carer, Quinn, was 19 and he cared for his mum with a mental illness. He said, "It's always been tough. Mum and Dad got divorced when I was younger. I was back and forth between them. I think I was 7 different schools since kindergarten. I was always getting into trouble. I had the reputation of of the class clown. So every single class I would go in, I would get sent out almost straight away. It got to the point where I just kept getting in trouble and grounded at home all the time. And then Dad was like, I'm going to send you to live with your mum. He just said that as a throw off. And I'm like, I want to go and live with Mum. He was shocked. After Quinn moved back with his mum, he experienced more stability. During these years, he was able to turn around his behaviour. Due to the move, he attended a new school, made new friends, and linked into the local community centre. He said it was maybe halfway through year 10 when I just changed. I just settled down, matured. I was like, where is it going to get me being an idiot all the time? It's going to get me nowhere. He also took on more responsibility for the care of his mother. He understood that life had been difficult for her. He said, Mum has depression. She got married when she was 16, and she's been married, then had kids, and then got divorced. I take care of her now, give her a med sometimes. She can't work, she's sick. I give her money here and there every week. I'll help her shop sometimes, take her to the doctor. I do what I can. When we look at Quinn's experiences within the model, the asset model presented on the screen, we look beyond the risk factors such as poor academic performances and behaviour problems at school. A similar story to Tallulah emerges. Things started coming together for Quinn when he moved in with his mother, which meant he had changed schools, connected with different friends who introduced him to the local community centre. And it gave him a chance to develop social assets in the form of a support network of peers. At the centre, Quinn was supported by a social worker. He knew he could count on the social worker if he needed help, which enabled him to develop emotional assets. The social worker also provided him with detailed and appropriate career advice, which Quinn valued and he followed. The social worker helped him to successfully apply for TAFE, and at TAFE, Quinn was also well supported. And he said to his surprise, the TAFE teachers were impressed with the standard and quality of his work. He commented, it was a bit of a shock coming from the educators saying that my answers are of high standards. I never really got that at school. This gave Quinn the capacity to create a new identity and replace the class clown he thought of himself at school. He developed a sense of pride and achievement that impacted on his participation in further training and education. However, similar to Tallulah, the assets Quinn develops in the future and the outcomes he can achieve are influenced by the existing structural context. And given limited job opportunities for young people, Quinn's employment prospects are limited. And even if he can find a job, it's likely that it would be poorly paid and insecure. So these two case studies illustrate the contradictions in the young carer's lived experiences, at least in policy terms. On the one hand, both young people could be deemed at risk of welfare dependency. Tool as a young parent, receiving income support, had disengaged from school early, or Quinn, although he's participated in further education and training, his job prospects are very limited. However, focusing only on risk factors doesn't take account of these young people's non-economic contributions. That is the value of their unpaid caring work or the assets they develop through their caring and over time that supports theirs and others' participation. Through their caring for others, they are building important trusted relationships and developing skills such as advocacy and organisational skills, which are essential for young people's current and future agency and well-being. The case studies also point to key mobilisers such as trusted workers and supportive relationships and stable housing that improve young people's ability to access resources that enhance their well-being and participation, including health and education. Focusing on young carers' assets and how they are developed has the potential to identify key points of service intervention in policy and practice. Okay, so I'm now going to hand over to Sabera, who's going to talk about another case study.
Sabera, it's Paul. I think your microphone may be off.
Okay, sorry guys. I'm Sabera, and I'm presenting on behalf of our team, Professor Fiona Brooke, Joanna, and Sarita. And we are going to talk about neighborhood and neighborhood belonging and young people. And as we know that assets such as the one which explained in the previous presentation have a huge impact on mental health of young people. And we all know by evidence that assets such as neighborhood, family, and peers have a positive impact as a protective impact on mental health of young people. Just to give you a brief background, that there has been a huge emphasis in the past on health risk behavior among young people, despite the reduction of risk around, for example, misuse of alcohol and drug among adolescents. Still, most of evidence are focused on assessing the negative effects of risky behaviors among young people. But there are other ways to look at health and well-being of young people. For example, looking at protective factors would give us a different angle to look at young people's health. Protective factors such as peer support, family, neighborhood are not only critical, but also helping young people to thrive. There is a lack of evidence in this area on protective factors and protective assets. And as I mentioned, there's an imbalance between, when you go across literature, there is no balance between evidence that focus on mostly problem-based evidence, rather than highlighting the capacities and assets that can promote health and well-being of young people. Today, we are going to present a piece of evidence on protective assets. And for our analysis, we used longitudinal study of Australian children's so-called LSAC data. As presented by Fiona, this is the overarching suggested model for our project. And for this part of the project, which is mental health of young people, we are trying to look at interaction between different assets and its impact, of course, positive impact on mental health of young people. For example, what are those assets that enhance capacities or resources or facilities for young people to thrive, or how we can tackle inequalities and improve positive health outcomes for young people. So the areas of assets which we specifically looked at are neighborhood sense of belonging, family, and peer relationship. For example, in the area of neighborhood, the issues such as social capital, neighborhood society characteristic, and resources are the area of focus. And the measures could be active volunteering, attachment, community involvement, and personal safety. With assets in relation to family, all the issues around parenting, parent-child relationship, and parents living with children or elsewhere are the area of focus. And the measures could be interpersonal connection, financial support, social support, or, for example, families' ability to get along with their child, and some measures of violence and abuse. In terms of peer relationship, the issues that we could look are all issues surrounding interaction of child within a school, home, and neighborhood. It could measure sexual harassment, bullying, victimization, and also intolerance. So the overall aim of this part of the project is to examine the association between those protective factors which we explained, such as social environment, neighborhood belonging, and social support, on mental health and well-being of young people. For the analysis, as I mentioned, we used LSAC data from wave 5, 6, 7. LSAC data is a national survey data and examine a wide range of research questions about development and well-being of young people in relation to different topics, from parenting, family, peer education, etc., to the neighborhood which we are looking at today. And we used both a descriptive analysis and a more sophisticated and comprehensive multi-level modeling which I'm going to explain in the next few slides. The outcome measures for this study covers the areas such as neighborhood facility, neighborhood belonging, such as social cohesion and trust, and neighborhood physical condition. Since ELSAC data was based on cluster design and used postcode as a primary sample, we also used postcode indicator as a control variable to reduce our bias. Child-reported SDQ total difficulty was used to measure them or assess the mental health of adolescents. SDQ is a tool, is a standardized international tool, or we can call it strength difficulty questionnaire, which has different items to measure the behavioral and emotional issues on young people between age 4 to 17, 18. And for this data, ELSAC data, they use 25 items on psychological attributes. We also examine the relationship between the neighborhood variables and mental health status of young people, such as age, gender, and the place which children living with both parents, and also peer positive and warm parenting. The socio-economic status of area was used to measure the neighborhood socio-economic status in terms of people's access to material and social resources. We also use remoteness area classification, which is an indication of access to developmental opportunity, and it was categorized by accessible, moderately accessible, to remote, and very remote. As I mentioned earlier, we used 3 waves of data, which is the wave 5, 6, and 7, and a sample of 3,000 to 4,000 children repeatedly used in each of these waves. The age range of these children were between 12 to 18 across 3 waves, and with the means of 13 years old for wave 5, 15 for wave 6, and 17 years old for wave 7. And of course, the comprised of population was 51% boys, and the rest were girls. And okay, our descriptive analysis shows a high level of average score of the neighborhood, which parents report is actually average score of neighborhood livability and facility, and also social belonging, which was really scored high by parents. Children were also perceiving a high level of average score on peer positive attributes. 83% of children in this sample living with 2 parents in the household, and 97% of our children have a mother from non-Indigenous background, and over 2/3 of our children in the sample living in accessible or highly accessible area, which these data also represent the limitation of ELSAC data, which is mostly focused on metropolitan area, and also it's not very diverse population. It's mostly focused on non-Indigenous background or mostly white Australian population. And the data also showed that children were living in a household with income of 0 to 1,600 with average of 2,300, and with a high level of parental warmth. Parental warmth is a scale that consists of items that ask parents to indicate how often they express their affection to children. For example, kissing, hugging, or saying I love you to the children, different items. And for this data, they used the 5 items, and the score is quite high. The mental health is a gender issue, which is not an unknown fact to us, and we know that, and our data also confirm that the girls have the higher total difficulty score or poorer mental health score, and boys have a lower pro-social behavior score. Pro-social behavior score intend to benefit society by helping each other, sharing, donating, volunteering, and cooperating, and boys seem to have a poorer score in this area. Neighborhood safety as a protective measure was area of interest for this study, for this part of the project. But unfortunately, this data is only available in wave 7, age 16 to 18, and the rest of the waves which we looked at, children doesn't report this variable. We assume that this age group, 16 to 18, are more likely to spend time outside home, and they have better understanding and perspective of how safe is their neighborhood. Anyway, our analysis shows that those who perceive their neighborhood as safe or very safe, they tend to have a better mental health score compared to those who reported their neighborhood as unsafe. Our marginal mean estimate also shows that the condition of neighborhood have a huge impact on mental health of young people. Those who have access to good condition or very good condition, they have better total difficulty score or better mental health score. Therefore, we assume that developmental opportunity is a great asset for young people to thrive. And also, the mental health score was higher or better among those who live in highly accessible or accessible area compared to remote area. In a simple and plain language, because this is very sophisticated statistical analysis, we can say that the higher neighborhood belonging score was significantly associated with better mental health and emotional difficulty of young people. Also, parental warmth score was associated with better mental health score among children. And when two parents are living in the same household, it was significantly associated with better mental health outcome among the population he studied. And finally, this is a known fact: the better the socioeconomic of family and neighborhood, the lower the risk of mental health problem. Okay, moving beyond the traditional risk perspective and look at the more asset-based model to identify protective asset, and would enable us to develop intervention that expand the environment for young people. Our evidence, of course, highlight all the ecological environments, such as the school, family, and neighborhood, and its impact on health and well-being of young people. And we need to support our young generation to build, maintain, and develop these kind of assets. And finally, our next step is to refine this asset-based model and expand its applicability, not only with respect to health, but also with respect to education and well-being also. Over the next 2 years, in addition to expanding our work on young people and young carers and neighborhood belonging, which was presented today, we will also be examining young people's engagement in extracurricular activity, young people's agency in the context of poverty, and the representation of young people with disability in large-scale surveys that are used to inform policy. Thank you so much. I think that's all from my side, and I will handing over to Gerry for Q&A session.
Okay, thank you very much, Sabera. Thanks, Kathy and Fiona as well for your presentations. I'm going to leave it to Paul to pass me through any questions that have arisen from the audience, from the panel. If you have any questions, please pass them through, and we can answer them in the next few minutes. I realize the seminar finishes in about 7 minutes, or we can, if we don't have time, we can answer them afterwards by email. We're very happy to engage with you.
Thanks, Gerry. We just have the one at this stage, and that is it possible to get a list of references at the end of this presentation? I think we can jointly answer that. If all the presenters are happy to, Racy will post the PowerPoint slides along with what we hope will be a recording of this webinar on our website in the next week or so, and perhaps the presenters can add any references they wish to at the end, if that sounds okay, Gerry?
That's absolutely fine, and they can also look up all the projects that we referred to on the project website. I think you can see the URL up there at the moment. So please do look at that too. But yeah, we can certainly share all the references.
Great, thank you. That's it, but I guess I just asked the question from the Eracy perspective. Are you guys aware, I guess it's pretty early days, but are you folks seeing anywhere where these strengths-based or assets-based approaches are taking hold, and perhaps where they may be dealing with the matter of the moment, which is COVID and the economic downturn?
Maybe Fiona or Colin would like to have a go at answering that, because they've been working in this area, I'm aware.
It's Colin MacDougall. Look, let me try just off the top of my head. My Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues that I work with do a lot of strength-based stuff, strength-based work, and they do it for a number of reasons. And one of them is that when you're marginalised, it's very hard to talk about pathogenesis and disease all the time. It's just not a very good thing to do. And as workers, they find it much more positive to be trying to celebrate success stories and build on strengths. So a lot of it, my colleague, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues are reporting that they're seeing really good evidence of strength-based work. In relation to COVID, I'm doing a review at the moment, but the problem for COVID is that the public health response has restricted opportunities for young people to engage in the usual kind of positive behaviours. And there was a study that colleagues at Melbourne have just done, in which they looked at children who were in prep at the time of the Black Saturday bushfires in 2009, and it charted their academic achievements and found that those who were more exposed to the disaster gradually did poorly compared with people who weren't. But then the kicker then happened in that same cohort did their final year of school during COVID. So I think what it tells us is we have to start looking at life course, but we also have to look at the effects of major external events on the developmental course of children. So I think in summary, a lot of people are trying to do it, but as Fiona said, when you analyse all Australian health policies which we have, there is very little in there on strengths. It's all about deficits. So and I suppose the other point is that, coming back to the model Fiona presented, is that you can't always disentangle strengths from weaknesses, because you actually need all of them. You do need someone to fix your broken leg and someone to work on your well-being and your spirituality, for example. So they're also all mixed up. So in the midst of working in a pathogenic way, there will be some people who will do little bits of strength-based stuff.
Fiona, do you want to add one final?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, and what we are seeing, and what I'm seeing a lot more of, is interest and requests for indicators when we're thinking about young people's overall well-being and life outcomes that are assets-based. So we're seeing a movement away from the traditional recording of, the sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and actually thinking about young people much more broadly, and indicators which are harder to measure but are assets based. So things around teacher connectedness, school belonging, all of those, there's a greater level of interest on wanting to look at data that actually gives those kinds of indicators, which I think is really encouraging. Jen, I think you have examples as well.
Yeah, I do. So I think it was a really great question. And one of the things that I see is that in the education sector, a lot of kids disconnected from school, and there's large groups of kids who are having trouble reconnecting. And if we look at some of the policy that's been implemented post-COVID, some on recommendations from people like the Grattan Institute, it's been to fly in tutors to help kids catch up at school. Now, if you use an asset-based model to think about the problem, your solution might be a little different. So you might be building capacity in local communities to help re-engage kids with school. And you would be working with community members, because we know from an asset-based model that when particularly kids who are at very high risk of disengagement in communities where there isn't a lot of trust in the schooling system, actually working with those adults is the way to support kids to re-engage after COVID. And I think that we can stretch that sort of analogy across to mental health and to a whole range of the issues that are facing young people during COVID. One of the other things that I would say is that there's a lot of positive youth development programs out there, and they are the ones who seem to be paying slightly more than lip service to strength-based approaches. Everyone says they're doing strength-based approaches, but they're often not, and it's because we are still back seeing assets in that additive way that Fiona talked about in the beginning, rather than this kind of much higher levels of complexity. And lots of those organisations have really struggled with COVID, because part of what they do with young people who are highly disadvantaged is they use things like sport to connect with them. And of course, physicality is the one thing that we, Zoom can't do for us. So I think COVID's been incredibly challenging, but I think things like this asset model actually are quite helpful for thinking through some of the complexities that it's presented to disadvantaged young people.
Okay, thank you very much. Paul, are we out of time?
We're on time. There is one more question about sibling connections, but I'll pass that through because it's not actually clear to me who's asked it. But I'll pass that through to you guys anyway, and perhaps we can put a written response to that with our recording on the website. Which brings me to the concluding remarks. So thank you, Gerry, and all our presenters today for the webinar, and thank you everyone who's attended. The recording of this webinar will appear on our website in the not too distant future, and again, if we can get the references along with the presentations from the presenters, we'll put those up as well. Keep an eye out for our e-bulletin, our Friday e-bulletin. We'll put the links in there when it's all up and ready to go. That will probably be not this Friday, but next Friday. And that, I think, is a wrap. So thanks again, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day. And you can all go back now and fall hungrily upon the US presidential election coverage. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.